of the University College Isle of Man's new public lecture series in History and Heritage. The lecture series was launched last year with a view to showcasing new research in history and heritage, both on the Isle of Man and further afield. There are 9 lectures in this year's series, running from October right through till next June, and we have a wonderful array of topics for you to explore. From Neolithic stone axes to Viking Manx crosses, from the lordship of the island in the late medieval period to the 19th century struggle for political reform, and more recently, from the island's role as both a custodian and also a liberator during the Second World War. There are a handful of programmes down the front. Feel free to take one away with you when you leave this evening. To launch the new lecture series, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Edmund Southworth, Director of Manx National Heritage and member of University College Isle of Man's governing body. Mr Southworth has worked in museums for over 30 years, spending 9 years as Director of Lancashire Museums before moving to the Isle of Man to take up his current role in 2009. Manx National Heritage, as the island's statutory heritage agency, looks after a wide array of heritage assets, ranging in date, a little bit like this lecture series, from prehistory right through to the present day. But I think I'm probably right in saying that there are few sites on the island that are as complex as the one we're going to hear about this evening. From its construction in the late 12th, early 13th century, Castle Rushen has been developed on numerous occasions by successive rulers and has served a variety of different purposes during its long history. And I'm very much looking forward to learning more about this medieval castle that continues to fascinate us all, even today. Welcome.
Pastor Mai, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to split this presentation into 3 parts. I'll introduce Conservation Management Plan, and I'll finish by talking about some of the recent work. And the core of the lecture, therefore, is about 800 years in about 45 minutes. If I appear to be speeding, that's the reason for it. And maybe I should start by admitting that I've been interested in castles for a very long time. I actually do remember terrifying my father when I was a child by leaning out over the ramparts of Conwy Castle to look at a train that was going past. But it wasn't until comparatively recently that I got one of my own to look after. Castle, that is, not train. Horse trams do not count. And actually this was my first castle, which is Lancaster, and I was responsible for parts of that as head of Lancashire County Museum Service. And of course you can see from the Great Keep, you can see the Isle of Man. And then the second castle I had the privilege of looking after is Clitheroe in the Ribble Valley, where I project managed this building, which was constructed to join the 2 parts of the castle together as a £3.5 million lottery-funded project. Finished that just before I came here, which was good fun. So, what did I find when I came to the Isle of Man? That's a rhetorical question, to which you're going to get some of the answer. This is what a heritage agency is looking for. Do come in. I hope you can see the screen from there, Joe. Heritage agencies are looking really primarily to do 2 things. They're looking after the physical care and maintenance of the buildings and the estate, and they're delivering public access and interpretation to that heritage asset. And here's a checklist of the sorts of things you'd expect to find in a generic, typical heritage asset like Castle Rushen. It does not score highly. It's been managed by Manx National Heritage since 1988. And yes, that bucket is to collect water, as Ashley will know too well. Now, significant work was done in the late 80s to install these interpretive displays and to make the castle suitable for visitors at this point in the 20th century. Only relatively minor improvements were made to the fabric of the structures, and documentary evidence was collected, but only really the surface skimmed, and some limited excavation. There's unfortunately not a lot of previous work to go on, and there are numerous references in the records of travellers from the centuries gone by, but they're rarely very detailed. Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments in England, O'Neill, published a paper in 1951 on the castle, and he demonstrated that he understood basically how it worked, particularly in terms of fortifications, which was his particular field. But no more recent study has been attempted. The history of the Isle of Man, the latest volume, gives you a context, but no one has sat down to write the history of Castle Rushen. But I do know that other people are working on individual bits. I'll embarrass Helen, if I may, by saying your work on the prison papers is suddenly revealing lots of interesting questions and answers as well. The site was substantially renovated by the local architect, Armitage Rigby. I say local architect, he was not a Manx architect in all senses. And that was in the early years of the 20th century. And it was under the direction of the then Governor Lord Raglan. Rigby authored a paper, which wasn't published until 1927, long after his death. And his survey is sound, no doubt about that, but he describes, for me, what is important, the removal of up to 4 feet, that's in old money about that much, of accumulated debris, rubble surfaces, miscellaneous buildings and their foundations. And that was done quite deliberately to reveal what he felt were original ground levels and what a medieval castle should look like. Now sadly, for one reason or another, there are either no records or we have not found them, and after all this time I'm beginning to think there are no records, which would help us to interpret what Rigby found, and therefore the possibility for modern archaeological investigation has been considerably reduced. So we, in one sense, we are already one hand tied behind our back in understanding Castle Rushen. Another less than brilliant image of the castle. The site was reopened in 1991, and to be fair, it's operated pretty well since then, attracting something like 30,000 paying visitors a year. 25 years on, the condition of some aspects of the complex is giving cause for concern. We've actually got further parts of the building accessible to us, such as the courtroom and Derby House, which wasn't available in 1991. And the visitor figures, the visitor facilities, dare I say toilets, are showing their age. I don't mean medieval. It's an enormous challenge. My head of properties, Steve Blackford, who I really do need to acknowledge, suggested it would be best if we actually bit the bullet and undertook a full conservation management plan. And I'm grateful for that emphasis, and I think you all subsequently for many years will be grateful for that. The plan was put together by Paul Drury, who's a distinguished antiquarian, archaeologist, and the person who wrote the guidance for the Heritage Lottery Fund on how to do conservation management plans. If you're going to do a complicated building, start at the top, go get the best you can. And Paul subsequently did a paper on the topic to the Society of Antiquaries in London on the castle, which is the best way we thought of getting peer review. So I'm very grateful to him for letting me recycle some of the elements of his work, and particularly his illustration. It's the year of architecture here at the moment, and one of the things we're talking about is conservation. What do we mean? Well, it's the management of change. And the Borough Charter suggests that our emphasis is about values, the values embodied by the heritage, not necessarily strictly preserving the architectural as it is now. The management of change. And the test of good conservation is really whether it sustains or detracts from the significance of the asset. So the plan is more than just an architectural study. We try and look at the value, its community value, what the community thinks of it. We look hard at the pressures and the practical issues that face the site. And we also feed in expert challenge, some element of peer review, and it's an iterative process. We start with some draft options and then we look at them as we go forward. As I said, there's very limited archival evidence. Illustrations only really appear in the 17th century, and once we started looking, we realised how awful, really, the archaeological treatment of Castletown is. As a town of such significance, with such an amazing heritage, and with such a lot of development in recent years, the archaeological oversight has really been, in my view, very weak. The process involves ourselves and Paul Drury crawling over the building. We've looked at every space. There's a gazetteer of every room. There's a chronology of window and door types. If you're really interested, that's in an appendix. It is probably about that thick in terms of a piece of work. And it's raised an awful lot of questions. And like in any good piece of work, there's as many questions asked as there are solutions given. So that's what we've been doing. That's what we've been using as our evidence. And just one example of a piece of archaeological investigation which I'm struggling to make head over tail. Do come in. Thank you. Sorry. And just for reference, and you refer to some of these terms as we go on, that's what we have got today. Those are the key components. In terms of phases, it can be split into the Royal Palace, the civil fortification, the fortification subsequently, a visitor attraction and so on. But what I'm going to try and do is break it down into what Paul Drury felt were the main building phases, and I'm going to try and cross-reference those to historical events and other cultural activities which put those building phases into context. One of the challenges I have is that I became an archaeologist, so I wouldn't have to remember dates. We can deal in eras and periods and so on. However, there are quite a few dates, so I had to write some of these down. And I was just explaining earlier that having switched the lights off, I can now not see some things that I've written down. So forgive me slightly. The exact date of the start of construction and the founding of Castle Rushen is unknown, but the most likely, as far as we're concerned now, is that it starts somewhere between 1180 and 1200. That's not guesswork, that's really on the balance of evidence of the building styles and the political events. Now the context clearly is a shift from the Norse-facing island to the English-facing island, and the context is the start of really the Plantagenet, a very strong dynasty indeed in England. Ragnvaldr, or Reginald, or it's probably about 30 different ways of spelling and pronouncing his name, takes office in 1187. But there's a bigger context, I think, in that his sister, Africa, was married in about 1180 John de Courcy. Now John de Courcy is very clearly, the name will tell you, of good sound Norman stock. Of course, you could describe the Normans as an alternative wing of Vikings, but by this time they are Norman. And it's his campaign in the north of Ireland which sees quite aggressive castle building. And I think it's inconceivable that with that close relationship, Ragnvaldr was unaware of how to build castles. Carrickfergus Castle is around 1177 in terms of the start of its construction. It takes a few years. And Rognvaldr is supporting the Courcy with men and ships. Rognvaldr is quite an interesting character. He's playing the English and the Welsh and individual entrepreneurs. I mean, John de Courcy is a privateer at this time. He's operating with a certain amount of official sanction, but he's basically carving as much personal land in the north of Ireland as he can get away with. He got away with it till 1205, and not after that. So subsequently, Rognvaldr is sharing his allegiance. He's swearing allegiance to the English king and to the Norwegian king. And he gets lands granted in the northwest of England from the English king, but at the same time he's actually also supporting the Welsh with ships, and he's clearly a very interesting character. He's described in the Orkney saga as the greatest fighting man in all the western lands. For 3 whole years he had lived aboard long ships and not spent a single night under a sooty roof, which for a Viking is a good thing. Now, Castle Rushen shows similarities to Carrickfergus. It's a simple square stone keep, and we would suggest now that, we strongly suggest that there is an outer bailey. The entrance is there, and we suggest that the road out to Maloo Street is through a defended perimeter. There's no bank on Bank Street, by the way. That refers to some earthen structure, and we'll give some clues later on. But even looking at the modern, land boundaries, there is something going on there which suggests outer bailey to a castle. We also need to factor in what else is happening. Rushen Abbey is founded in 1134 in a place called Rushen. It has a brief spell in Douglas from 1192 to 6, but then is relocated to Ballasalla on the Silverburn. The Silverburn, the river that joins the two structures, and Abbeyland more or less adjoins Castletown and therefore the castle's land. And I think it's inconceivable that the two developments are not connected quite closely in this 20-year period. That's just a later view of sort of early 19th century view of what I still suggest is a bailey. One could argue that this is part of a planned town, but there's no evidence of that. That's postulating. Rognvaldr and his successors held the island despite some quite bitter struggles within the kingdom, which ended ultimately in the transfer of sovereignty from Norway to the new Scottish kingdom in 1268, Treaty of Perth, and so on. During this period, Castle Rushen becomes the main residence of the Kings of Man, and so much so that in 1257, Peel Castle, the other residence, is given to the church by King Magnus. The island remains strategically important to the English in the First Scottish War of Independence, and it may even have been attacked after Magnus's death at Castle Rushen in 1265. There's certainly a disruption in the building phases. But we know it definitely suffered in 1313 when Robert the Bruce besieged Castle Rushen at the height, really, of his operation. He landed at Ramsey, marched south, and took the castle in June. There is evidence in the remaining walls of the square tower of this event, in that the roofs and masonry were removed. Only the corners of the great tower remained. And that's either because the castle was made useless to the English by being partly demolished, or subsequent builders decided they couldn't reuse elements and they had to reduce the walls to get down to a stable platform. Impossible to tell in the architecture. But just to remind you what a square keep looks like, it's a big solid square tower with rooms inside, and the entrance is always at first floor level and it's temporary, it's wooden staircases which can be removed in case of conflict. So there's no grand gatehouse in this sort of tower. And there's the evidence for the remains of this first period of building, actually in the walls. And that's no good point at which to show this slide, but to remind you that we're not talking about people going into a quarry and laboriously carving stone. It is in layers on the beach ready and just has to be levered out and carried. So a stone-built castle in Wales, slightly more expensive. In Castle Rushen, less expensive, more achievable. Clearly there's a lot of labour, but it's not masons carving it in the first instance. Give me so far. Right. The island seems not to have played much part in the Second Scottish War of Independence. Presumably we'll have another War of Independence next year. But its strategic importance was recognised by Edward III after his decisive defeat of the Scots. In 1337 he granted the island to Montacute, or Montague, the first Earl of Salisbury. It's unclear whether Montacute ever visited Man, but certainly he was clearly in control of it from about 1343. And we think we can identify two significant phases of rebuilding from then on. And it's worth noting that William's grandfather, Simon Montacute, had actually been the custodian of Beaumaris Castle. Beaumaris, one of those amazing castles, never finished, but it's important because it's a port castle. It's a naval operation. And Simon Montacute was admiral of the King's Fleet, active in the Irish Sea during the Welsh and Scottish campaigns. So clearly there is a family there that understands naval power and it understands military fortification. There's a link. Simon had married Africa, a daughter of Rognvalda, who by then was the widow of John de Courcy. And this established a rather tenuous Montacute claim to the Manx throne, but it was used to try and legitimise it. Just in case you hadn't noticed, people like things in black and white, so the white is what's happening politically, and the black is actually what's happening to the castle. I should explain that in phase one. What we have got is the addition of towers to two sides. We have an extension of the entrance and the creation of a gateway, and the surrounding mantlet walls which flank and protect the entrance. And again, this for me is another piece of evidence or argument for the existence of a bailey. The bailey is where you do all the dirty and dangerous stuff, so you keep the horses and light fires to smelt and cook and things like that. Not everybody can live in that small tower. A detail. We think that the courtyard is shrunk in size, and the other structures built around the walls. And if you're familiar with that, people often say, why is that fireplace outside? Well, it wasn't outside when it was built. And just going back, that wall is there, joining the tower. So we're quite clear about that, I think. The towers are amazing, absolutely solid, thick at the base. They're completely indestructible, impregnable. And the only concession to that is garderobe shafts, which is the polite word for toilet for those of you new to castles. And there's quite elegant chamfered sandstone ribs in the first floors of those towers, and we think that we're quite comfortable about the date that this type of structure gives. The period from the 1390s onwards continues to see the island held by people very close to the King of England, very close to the King of England. And the fortification continues to reflect that strategic importance to England within the Irish Sea. But the emphasis is on the threat of foreign powers and the threat from the sea. Previously, it's been facing inland, up the Silverburn. Artillery is key to this design, and it's both offensive artillery and defensive. Sir Richard le Scroope, the first Lord Scroope, wonderful name, purchased the island in 1392 from William de Montacute. And £10,000 it cost him, and it was a present for his son. His son William became the sovereign Lord of Man, and he used the title King. He was a pretty important character in English history. He had the wealth, certainly, to spend on Castle Rushen if he wanted. 1394, he was Vice Chamberlain of the Royal Household under Richard II. He was Lord Chamberlain by 1396 and created Earl of Wiltshire in 1397. He acted as jailer for the Earl of Warwick, and guess where the jail was? Here on the Isle of Man. And conveniently for le Scroope, the Warwick estates also found their way to the Isle of Man. So this was clearly a family with considerable wealth and the ability to fortify. Unfortunately, he was executed without trial by the new King Henry in 1399, and his estates confiscated by the Crown. 1404, as you can see, the island is granted to Sir John Stanley, who rather wisely, in view of what had happened to his predecessor, chose the title of Lord of Man instead of King of Man. And we know that the early Stanleys ruled from afar, and the castle was furnished as an occasional residence, but with little real significant impact immediately on the structure of the building. We've got records from this period. We know that there's a garrison. They brought it in from Lancashire. Their main residence remains in Lancashire. Indeed, when they were rewarded for being the kingmakers, because they chose the right side at the Battle of Bosworth, by waiting till halfway through the battle to see who was winning. What else would you do? In 1485, they chose to site their new castle at Latham near Ormskirk, which was the family seat, not on the Isle of Man. And that castle, amazingly, was ready for a royal visit in 1495. So clearly their newfound wealth and importance and authority for them was more politic, being in Lancashire itself. In terms of the building itself, by the 1390s, and we can't be precise about the dates, but the Great Tower has been raised again, and it's 3 stories high. There's an east tower added, and a significant gatehouse, a new outer gatehouse, and the barbican, and there is a curtain wall and a ditch around the outside. This is a very significant investment and was obviously not done overnight. The curtain wall is built in 3 phases with increasing sophistication at each phase. And the last phase shows 6 substantial firing platforms for heavy weaponry. You start off here, and these are small emplacements, and you think, why there? By that time there is no gate, but presumably the remains of the road to Maloo Street are still active in some way. So that point is still worth defending, and there is a flat piece of wall, even today, at that point. And it has no sense at all in terms of the rest of the castle. But the blue phase has quite decent sized turrets, but by the time you get into green, you've 2 enormous fortifications which are capable of housing a significant castle. Gunpowder weapons. Allegedly, Edward III used them against the Scots at Stirling Castle, but the first recorded use of artillery, so that's my watching time keeps on. You're at risk of me not knowing how to. Battle of Cressy, 3046. If anyone knows of any other use of artillery, it would be helpful, but we can only really conjecture when the builders of Castle Rushen thought it was appropriate to not only protect against artillery, but also to make provisions for offensive use of artillery as well. But very clearly, the three phases of that wall, complete by the 1390s, show that development. The keep is amazingly sophisticated, so that's just one of the later turrets. And you see a gun embrasure, the technical term, and the window replaces a port for the gun, and the gun could also be on the top. So these are quite sophisticated structures. You see how the gatehouse has been constructed. And this is the chamber for the portcullis. These are the chambers for the guard. And I think if you go to level 6, very sophisticated architecture in terms of defending the castle. To get to this room, which is the King's office, you have to go up this step. Cross your way through 1, 2, 3, narrow passages through the wall, heavily fortified rooms. To get to that room, you have to go up that stairs. You can't go from there to there. You can get you up to there, but you can't get to there. And of course, that is the safe that's in that wall there. Very, very important understanding of how to get into castles. And then even on the floor above, you have a room here, very important room, which is accessed from there. But you go up that steps, and of course you can't get to it. So even if you knew your way around this castle, which not everybody did, of course, attacking it would have been very, very difficult. This is a sophisticated architect who knows how to build castles, no doubt about it. Both the gatehouses have drawbridges, portcullis, murder holes, as you'd expect, but it's actually quite civilised. There's loads of toilets and a lot of fireplaces. It's actually quite domestic, and that's unusual because it does not have a large number of what I would call public rooms where the Lord, the King, is entertaining or doing public functions. It remains fairly impressive and domestic. Right, we're now in the Tudor period, still called Lords of Man. The Tudor period, was important. The Isle of Man was not immune from the turmoil. Rushen Abbey was demolished after the dissolution of the monasteries. The Stanleys were defending the Irish Sea against, take your pick, French, Spanish, Irish, always the Scots. The castle rolls note that 40 archers, for example, were sent from Lancashire, 1533, 100 men sent in 1540. We know the garrison in 1593 has 40 soldiers, plus officers, including a gunner and a keeper of artillery. I started my museum career as a keeper of artillery, pretty good. The importance of the island is confirmed at the end of the 16th century when the 5th Earl of Derby dies. His will is disputed by the family, and as is often the case, till the lawyers sort it out, there's an interregnum. During that interregnum, Queen Elizabeth took personal possession and sent Thomas Gerard, or Garrett, with the instruction to do, quote, what is fit to be done for the better security of the place. So, royal decree. To digress slightly, the clock, always thought to be a gift by Elizabeth, more likely to be part of this refurbishment by Gerard at the Royal Command. Recently we radiocarbon dated the frame, and it confirms absolutely slap bang Queen Elizabeth period, as much as you can do with radiocarbon dating. That we can't say whoever came and wound it, there's no evidence for that. By 1609, the Stanleys are confirmed as Lords of Man by the Privy Council, and the castle continues to be upgraded to perform these military and domestic functions. I've just told you that. We get a round tower, there, and there, and there. We get a second bailey because of the construction of an earth glacis. And in my view, and Paul Drury's view, and I'm still trying to win David Wilson round, the absence of a glacis there suggests to me that there is still something at that Bailey or Bank Street end, which means you do not need a glacis. Again, evidence is not obvious, but I think the theory is now increasingly tenable. The Barbican's extended slightly, and domestic accommodation fit for a lord is enhanced with a new long gallery above the gatehouse at this point, and then superseded in 1582 by a new house here inside the Inner Bailey. And interestingly, it incorporates the curtain wall, which is a little bit strange. So, a rather romantic view of the machine which kills people, because that's what they do. There are fields of fire right over the Silverburn, and you can, from the roof, determine the larger cannon in any direction you want. Note the glacis, which is not just a bank of earth, it's got stone structures inside it, protecting it, and on a couple of occasions it's very sneaky. It has a hidden turret inside the glacis, and presumably some kind of trapdoor which would open and fire on unsuspecting defenders. That is a sophisticated piece of nasty and aggressive defence. But again, by an architect who knew precisely what they were doing. Here's the new chamber on the top. Quite an elegant room. Indeed, this is before it has its museum displays in. And I'm very tempted to take the museum displays out and say, actually, you know, this is a nice room, and we can do things in that room which you can't otherwise. And here's your 3 windows, which, you know, just put it into context. It's well defended, but it's also an elegant residential space. Period 5, the Civil War. I'm always very cautious in the Manx audience in saying much about the English Civil War, because you've usually had presentations from Jennifer who's told exactly what happened in the Civil War. To summarise then, the island is held by the Royalists, James Stanley, and he prepared the island not just for war, but as probably a place of safety for other Royalist sympathisers and refugees. He fortifies the island with a fort at St Michael's Isle, we know, and there's one at Douglas. And Castle Rushen by then is already an impressive, well-defended structure, so they only need to make minor improvements. They adapt the Barbican entrance to allow muskets to be fired in safety, but the largest intervention is actually outside, which is the formation of what's called the New Work, a very substantial gun platform on the riverbank, dominating the entrance to the harbour. Again, it is the seaborne enemy which is a threat, and protecting the main gate. And the platform is also protecting a rather elegant but very exposed upper storey added to Derby House in 1645, when the Civil War is already happening. And there's an awful lot of glass in those windows, and I personally would not have done it. So maybe the New Work was an afterthought. And interestingly, for those of a technical nature, this is the first time we see the use of brick, actually at that point imported from Lancashire. Now, we know James Stanley's political stance is not shared by the local population, particularly in view of the local taxation and levies he imposed, as he raised substantial bodies of troops for his cause. He refused to surrender the island, and indeed took 300 Manxmen to fight to support the king in battle, probably unwillingly. After defeat at the Battle of Worcester and allegations of massacre of civilians, he was returned to Bolton and executed in 1651. The local Manx community and military leaders had seen how ruthless Cromwell had been in Ireland, and they acted to take control. You could call it rebellion, you could call it common sense, to take control of the military infrastructure of the island. Colonel Duckenfield was on his way from Wales with the fleet. They had not quite sorted out Castle Rushen, and it was the Countess of Derby who had retrenched famously into Castle Rushen, and she was the woman allegedly who had already defeated Fairfax at Latham and showed no sign of surrender. The story is that the defenders opened Sallyport, and it's legendary now with her chief advisor William Christian getting the blame, being executed, and now the figurehead of Manx nationalism. What does that look like? As I say, minor improvements, just small walls putting in to protect the flank, and this significant new development without which we would not have the group lot. From the back, still it's a little bit of a mess. Very, very clearly, the top story does not quite fit the other two. That's not a seamless joint. Even I, I'm not an architectural historian, can see that's a big joint. And a word of advice: never build on top of a medieval ditch, because that's what happens if you do. But from the front, I have to say, that is impressive. That is a civil structure, it's a domestic structure, and there's an awful lot of glass in those windows if you've got a musket handy, hence the need to protect it. However, it originally had another story as well, the garreted, quite a steep roof, so what you're looking at is not as grand as it originally was. And here is the new work, a very substantial piece of construction, and a rather elegant, if inaccurate, view of the gun battery there. And another view. And if you wonder why the bus has difficulty getting past Castle Rushen, well, you can get a bus through that. Here's the wall, and these little squares, they're all over, and they are the kind of musket, because the best way to stop a cannon firing at you is to shoot the people operating the cannon, and therefore the long-range musket is the answer to that, if you can get far enough. Obviously a big cannon's further away, and at that point, what is now Lawn House is an empty plot, probably, and actually, in strategic terms, dominates the castle. So, yes, you need to sort that out. Period 6. We're getting on. The restored monarchy and the re-establishment of the Stanley family bring a period of stability and prosperity. William the 9th Earl visits in 1691, and we know from that time he's improving it. There's a stock of 90,000 bricks by that time being made locally. We've got a detailed inventory and so on. Now the Act of Union 1709 makes the Irish sea a safer place, and therefore the fortifications of the island are downgraded. So what you see is the start of what I would describe as home and office. There are domestic features, but there's also the start of civil facilities. It's an administrative centre. There's a garden in the moat. There's a pigeon house instead of a round battery. And the illustrations show the turrets roofed and used as offices, and therefore totally incapable of providing cannon emplacements. There's a mint in 1733 to service the rapid increase in mercantile activity as the islands profiting from the trade with the Caribbean, and that does include the slave trade. The mint is brick built, interestingly, and the castle continues to be used as a prison, famously with Bishop Wilson incarcerated there in 1722. The fact that the downgrade continues is suggested by the fact that on his first visit to the Isle of Man in 1736, the Duke of Athol is advised not just to bring his own bed linen, but to bring the bed as well. And so this is how the various rooms are arranged in the 1701 inventory. My Lord's bedchamber, my Lord's dressing room, my lady's chamber. Something wrong here, my lady's chamber has a very small closet there. But for the first time, you've got gates in walls. You don't put gates in walls if you're defending it. You roof over the dovecot, and there's a roof over this kind of placement. So you've got this transition period clearly happening. And the process of domestication is accelerated by the Act of Revestment, 1763, and this brings the island under direct English control with a new governor. Almost immediately there's a barracks, there's stables built in the outer ward, stone, timber and lead are taken from earlier buildings, and it would appear that the keep itself is unroofed. Surveys of 1791 and 1779 are critical of its poor condition. So by 1814 we see 2 of those circular gun towers demolished, and by 1810 the castle is formally English Crown property and being administered by the Board of Ordnance, later the War Office, later the Ministry of Defence. The next few years brought by far the most substantial intervention in the complex, but one which ultimately saved it for future generations. A new prison building inside the Bailey was planned from 1811, but in the event the entire complex was converted, complete by 1816. There are new roofs, new timber, new lead, and fireproof stone floors. Also in the prison cells, wooden floors with no nails in them. I hadn't realised this, that in a prison you don't want people pulling the nails out and digging their way or using the weapons, so they're entirely wood paved. Those floors are still there. Almost all the space in the keep and the outer gatehouse are converted to cells or offices. Unfortunately for modern visitors trying to understand it, a very substantial stairwell was introduced which cut through the full height of the northwest corner of the keep. New houses, kitchens were built in the inner ward, as well as walls to separate the various categories of prisoners, felons and debtors from women, for example. And there's another major change in the setting of the castle sometime after the 1770s, when a new quay is constructed, and this reduces the effective height of the gatehouse and blocks the access to the stores under it. Sorry, we don't use the phrase dungeons, unlikely. It's definitely very good stores. And there's a lifeboat house constructed in 1826, refurbished in 1856, a new lifeboat house constructed in 1896, and the old one demolished shortly after. Use as a prison is not seen as incompatible with other uses, and it's not till 1834 that the governor ceased to use it as an official residence. When he went across the road to Lorne House, the prison is enlarged even further, and we've got a lot of documentation about this period when the Rolls Office is established in Derby House, the courtroom is modernised, and a police station built by the entrance, and the upper storey of Derby House removed. So you get clearly chimneys and roofs put on what were turrets, gates, that's the front, the other gate was the back, and people are building now all the way around, so there's no field of fire for your cannon. You've got neighbours. You can't fire at your neighbours. Rather ambitious plan for the castle. Not all of this was built, but it was bad enough having these very substantial stairwells. That's one of them. But bear in mind that space. The market square's here. Just look at that space and that one, the jailer's office. Now this is quite useful because you can see the arrangement of how individual rooms were supposed to be used. This is not an as-built plan. This is a proposal at that time. Again, more romantic, but I really do like these little sentry huts or watch houses. And the quayside develops. So those houses we saw earlier on have a road almost up to the windows, so flooding in those basements must be quite interesting. There's still a couple of houses further on which you have to go down to. And there's the lifeboat house. Here's the stables or associated buildings. There's the jailer's house. There. And there's a police station. Tony Brown tells me that the light was retained and he rewired it in the police station that's there now. Not in 1901, he tells me. We're nearly up to date. Castle Rushen seems to have welcomed visitors throughout the 19th century. And this is not simply as a heritage building. In common with other institutions, it was quite common practice to allow people to see those incarcerated prisoners, particularly people in asylums. They were quite part of the attraction. As the island's population grew and the influx of wealthy tourists led more people into temptation, the prison facilities were increasingly seen to be inadequate, and a new prison was built in Douglas, and 1891 the castle was vacated. The new police station is 1901, and it's rather whimsical. Is that 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or 2 minutes?
You've done 45, so
right, okay.
finish this soon.
That turret of the police station looks less whimsical when you see the turrets that were there and those conical roofs that were there when Bailey Scott did the police station. They weren't there 5 years later, and they're not there now. So it looks slightly incongruous, but at the time Bailey Scott was not importing something from Lower Saxony. He was taking his inspiration from what was across the road. Quite an important nuance there, I think. Now, I've referred to the 1904-10 restoration by Armitage Rigby under the direction of Lord Raglan. The intention was to restore an idealised medieval castle. And Raglan gained leave of the Treasury. I don't think he needed to ask the Treasury, he just told the Treasury, to use the revenue from sightseeing visitors to the castle to fund the works. No change there then. And as I said, the most intrusive feature is the removal of a substantial amount of surround. And this creation of an openness, a green sward, when we know from the corbels in the curtain room that there was a significant number of very large roof buildings all the way around in the medieval period. So Armitage got that wrong. However, he did keep most of what he found in the keep. For example, all the doors to the prison cells are there. And he did his best to maintain a sense of the functions of what the gatehouse did and so on. And from a conservation perspective, he adopted an explicit policy of distinguishing old from new. And he used a fresh sawn sandstone for repairs as opposed to other work in either the mudstone, limestone or the hand-cut sandstone. The Antiquarian Society and the newly formed Manx Museum and National Trust were allowed to use the facilities for displays, including casts of the sculptured Manx crosses and the newly excavated skeleton of a great deer, which I hope you're reading out recently. The castle was used as the main museum until 1922, when Tynwald voted funds to convert the old hospital in Douglas to Manx Museum, which is still in use today, I don't have to tell you, and that's where the deer is. The castle was handed over to the Manx authorities in 1929, and part remained as a courthouse and a registrar's office till 2012. Sadly, the court in the upper story of the gatehouse and Derby House were repaired and, as they say, modernised in 1970 to 72. And this saw the loss of Victorian fittings and intervention to the Jacobean part of Derby House. And in hindsight, that should not have happened. In 1988, as I said, management of the castle was transferred to Manx National Heritage. Demolition sometime after 1896 and before 1901. That's the Bailey Scott, the plot for the prison. Note that substantial building, which is not there now. I quite like these industrial. They are replacing something else. From the front, I like the idea of taking motor cars out of the square, personally, and that's the new jail block that you saw in the diagram from 1844. And again, good view of the stables that were constructed here. A very substantial gateway in, an enhanced gateway, again, not defensive, but keeps prisoners out, and that block. At some point the sundial has gone. Don't know where. So there, that wonderful occasion in 1929, and I'm sure you recognise some of those people. And I think this is a lovely bit of nationalism at play. But if you can read that, I blew it up. And this flag was last flown on the castle at the official transfer of Castle Rushen from the Crown to the Manx nation, and we let it rot. And this was the Victorian infrastructure for the court, which was used for the swearing in of the governor, and this disappeared in the 1970s. That's the end of part 2. Part 3. We finished the conservation plan in outline in 2011. We formalised it, it went to the trustees and endorsed in 2012. We've subsequently embarked on a series of actions which by themselves aren't actually earth-shattering, but over the next 20 years, if my successors carry on with it, which they have to, because otherwise the roof will continue to leak, we will make a significant impact. I mentioned leaking roofs. This is something Ashley did some work on before I think even I arrived, trying to tackle water ingress and tackling this issue of inappropriate cement rendering, tackling where the water comes in. And it's easy sometimes to work out where the water comes in. It's easy to work out where the water comes out. What it's doing in between, we don't know. Buildings like this, where the walls are that thick, the fancy masonry is on each side, in the middle is rubble. Over 800 years, the water washes through and the smaller particles descend to the bottom and you end up with void. When it rains, effectively you have built a cistern and the water will then make its own way out into the buckets you carefully provide for. So we're currently tackling water. I'll give you a couple of examples. We're tackling its ambience in the town where it sits. We're now, over this winter, working on our interpretation strategy, and there will be some minor changes to the displays, but they're going to take a few years to work our way through. There should be a new guidebook next summer, and ideally love to get a grip with the glasses. And over the next 20 years, shall we say? 15, 10? Depends how much money we throw at it. There are some small things to do, a schedule, working our way around the walls and roofs. We'd like to redo the gardens. Derby House is a big job, as is the courthouse. We also own the building which is used by Barclays. That is leased to Barclays, and as far as the Attorney General's office knows, it's the only 99-year lease on the island that's gone through 96 years. But we have to offer them first refusal. and as they only pay £10 a year, we've got quite a significant piece of negotiation to do on that one. And I put a little question mark over the police station, because yours truly would like that. My trustees may agree with that. The Department of Home Affairs may agree with that. I think there are some questions there as we go forward. Roofs. You start at the top when you're dealing with historic buildings, and just an example from the early medieval 14th century corbelling to support timbers, then subsequent layers of enhancement of roofs. So the roofs have undergone a lot of stress. And here is a typical 1814 prison roof, very steeply pitched with lead and slate, not native, but that's where the original roof was. And I don't know if you can work out, there's a tiny little drain there. The original drain was there and there. So those original drains were quite capable of taking large amounts of water off those roofs. It only takes, sadly, one pigeon and that drain, it actually drains, that drain goes into the garderobe. So it's not even going out the building, it's just going down the pan. So that is a new roof that we put on the West Tower a few years ago now. We have sealed round the edges so that water is not trickling through into the walls, and we have replaced slate with lead, because that is a better, again it's a far better way of dealing with it. Maintenance is lower, and we have adopted the drainage which is at this side to make sure it can go. Anyone who's been to a wedding in Derby House in the last 10 years will have to put wellies on. It's appallingly damp. Mould is growing on the walls, plaster is coming off the walls, and the problem is the walkway in front, which is effectively porous now. And what we've been doing is replacing, for example, that capping, which, fair enough at the time was cement and slate, trying to be waterproof. That's failed over many years, and therefore we have added in a lot of lead capping to stop that water coming through. And this last year, we did this 2015-16, is the broke up what was a rather decrepit concrete and replaced it again. There's concrete under there with lead flashing and a complete seal and a new drain, and we've even put a new downspout in, which is lead entirely in keeping with the others. So by managing water ingress, we will eventually solve the damp, but it could take 5 years for that building to dry out. This is a lot of masonry to tackle, and that's only a few metres of what is a very large wall. Showed you this before. I was fortunate enough to be invited to sit on Castletown Regeneration Committee, and whilst what we've done has not been perfect, it's been a compromise. I think it's better in terms of the relationship of the castle to the square. Certainly it's an improvement. And on the other side, described as a military library, it has WD, which is War Department, which dates it sometime before 1855, and sometime after 1814, because it was before that it was a colonial office. And it's described as a military library. Later on there's a customs house. That became surplus to requirements. It was empty, it's been used as a social services office until about 5 or 6 years ago, an unemployment office, garage for the police. We felt that the new work was such an important archaeological site, it was such an important vista for the town, that it should be protected, and the best way for Manx National Heritage to protect it is to own it. So we are transferring it. To give it a sustainable use, we've entered into a partnership with a well-known coffee franchise. I'm perfectly happy to say it's Costa. Nobody else on the island was capable of giving us the amount of investment that was required to give it a sustainable life, and giving us a market rent in years to come. So that building is protected, and it may be open on Saturday. The final slide is a conundrum. You saw the gentleman handing over the keys to the castle. They were standing on a bridge. You know that you go over to get to the keep, you go over a bridge, over the drawbridge pit. What you may not realise is that drawbridge pit was re-excavated and reconstructed by Armitage Rigby as well. That in the prison period, you just walked up to the front door, and there's 2 steps. So we are trying to work out, as part of our commitment to proper access for people with disabilities, as part of our interpretation, how do we tell the story and get people in, but also cope with the fact that that bridge is 100 years old and rotten. It's propped up from underneath, and if you do walk over it, be careful. It's safe, but it needs an alternative. So there you are. Wonderful bridge. And a bit of Manx. Don't know where that was. We lost that when Manx National Heritage took it over. Lovely Viking ship. And the next one? The prison period. It's a ground, 2 steps, flagged. And what Rigby did was to rebuild the walls based on this scar, and presumably what he found when he excavated that pit, because as you look down you can work out roughly where the original is, because he's left a reasonable gap, and also it's where the water comes out. The water comes out at the old capping. Underneath in that wall there's still the iron axle point set into granite for the drawbridge. So, by understanding the castle, this will be my final words I suppose, by understanding it, asking ourselves more questions, crawling over every square inch, the stories we tell as we go forward will, I think, be accurate, intriguing and honest. Thank you.